I don't know her. I don't know her personally, but we've corresponded a little bit and gone to know each other. And she's going to talk today about managing misinformation, distortion, denial, free speech in the media and college campuses. We're going to have a conversation. So Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law, Emerita at New York Law School, and the author of Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. She's a former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and she's a person who is an expert in the concept of what is free speech and the concept of how to look at censorship and free speech in our country. I think this is a burning issue for a lot of us, and I think she disappeared. Anyway, it's a very hot issue. It's a very important issue for a lot of us, and we hope that when she is back, she can speak to some of these issues.
Connection's gonna go in and out. There's just no way around it.
Okay, Nadine, yes, here, she's here. Hi, you missed your whole introduction.
I'm so sorry about that. And I'm really sorry about the terrible internet connection. For personal reasons that I cannot be there in person and I'm in this really iffy connection. I am absolutely brokenhearted. And I thank you so much for your patience with the technical difficulties, and we'll do our best, right?
Yes, inshallah, as we say. So Nadine and I want to have a conversation about this, and we thought we would kind of go back and forth, and I would ask her a couple of questions or 3 questions, and then open it up for audience. So one of the questions that I had for Nadine is a very large and broad question, but I think she can sort of talk about it from her perspective, is how do we as directors on higher ed campuses manage topics such as religion, race, gender, and class during the rise of cancel culture? You know, that came up in a few sessions today, Nadine, so I'm happy. So we're all warmed up for this. You take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. These are very important, difficult issues. And those of us who are working to promote human rights and diversity and inclusion and equity absolutely are committed to a robust conversation that includes all perspectives on all issues from everybody, regardless of identity and regardless of ideology or belief. Let me just share with you a couple of the techniques and strategies that I use as a law professor, which I believe would be workable in every other educational setting. And I have spoken to teachers at all levels and in all subjects who agree with this. One really important technique is to require of students, and I will just quote my own mantra for my law students, to be able to understand, articulate, and advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues, right? And by plausible perspectives, that means what are supported by whatever the relevant evidence is. Let me use my law courses about the Constitution as an example, but you could extrapolate to social science or humanities, philosophy, religion, whatever your own courses are. That the perspectives based in reasoned analysis, expert sources, and they cannot simply be conclusory statements that backed by analysis and reasoning and explanation. And no point may be simply an ad hominem attack. I'm getting a message, by the way, that my internet connection is unstable. Are you still able to hear me? Great, okay. And so once students are divorced from their own personal perspectives, but they're put in a position of being able to articulate other perspectives without identifying themselves with it, that frees students to be devil's advocates or angel's advocates. I do think it really is important for students to be able to take into account their own feelings and their own experiences and their own psyches and emotions, but not necessarily in a class setting. That may make them too vulnerable, and it may make them too vulnerable to the so-called cancel pressures. That is, if they say something that is seen as unpopular, they may not dare voice that perspective. But if you put in that layer, you are not identifying with that perspective yourself. You are simply being required to understand it and articulate it. That gives to extend curiosity and empathy, to build bridges across ideological, religious, identity, and other divides, is for people to technique regularly into class discussion. I think it has an excellent substantive impact because it really does make it easier for students to open their minds to different perspectives, but also makes it easier for them to dare to voice those perspectives and to inhibit others from resorting to shaming and shunning and retaliating in a canceling way.
Thank you. I mean, you are a little slow, but you're not cutting off totally, so that's good news. So I'm just thinking about what you just said. I mean, one of the things we've been having a discussion about is, we are, scholars of Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. We go into a classroom and we teach, and we don't come in and say, you have to believe this. Just as you said, we try to be objective. We know that's impossible as critical thinkers. But we also are experiencing a real pushback in evaluations from students. Even when we're giving facts to them about human rights. For example, I haven't done this yet because, it's summer, but, I will bring up Roe versus Wade. And I'll bring it up and say, okay, this is what and how it was held in court, and this is how it was dismantled. And as I do that, Nadine, there is still this sort of feeling like, why is she talking about that, right? Why is that important? Because it's always already controversial in that student's mind. So I guess my question is not just about freedom of speech and how one understands it today, examples of, US history and law, as you're an expert, but really freedom of speech for faculty and students, right? This is a campus of community. So we share that space in higher ed. We are in higher ed because we thought, at least I thought when I was getting my PhD, that I would have some kind of freedom of critical thinking, not ideology necessarily, but critical thinking and engaging the younger people.
Yes, it's a very troubling problem. Faculty members have not only the same free speech rights that other members of our society have, but we also have academic freedom, which it does entail certain responsibilities, to be sure, but it also entails added freedom to engage in critical inquiry in the quest of the pursuit of truth. You cannot pursue truth in any discipline without being free to A, express any idea, B, criticize any idea. Everything has to be subject to criticism and challenge, precisely because we recognize, as you said, Minas, that all of us are human beings. We cannot be perfectly objective. And so we try to counter our own internal biases, right? Cognitive biases, precisely by demanding of ourselves and others in our academic community that they question every single perspective, but not be subject to, again, shunning, silencing, or shaming for doing that. In our capacities as teachers, we do have a responsibility to communicate effectively with our students. And this is where it gets so tricky, because precisely as a result of the kinds of sensitivities and concerns that students have and are voicing about not wanting to be exposed to certain controversial ideas, ideas that they feel are inconsistent with their own deepest identities. And this is very broad. I mean, because you talk about an issue such as abortion, obviously that touches on deep-seated beliefs about religion, deep-seated beliefs about feminism, deep-seated beliefs about the origin of the beginning of human life, and so forth. And so I think we have to strive to find a way to say that every perspective is going to be respected, but that's a mutual proposition. Whether you agree with the Supreme Court's decision or disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, what we are going to do in class is to examine what the rationales were, not only for the majority opinion, but for the concurring opinions and the dissenting opinions, and that every single one of us, to the best of our human abilities, will be able to state the strongest possible argument in favor of and against each one of those perspectives. Because the point of the classroom exercise is not for students to make a decision about and announce to us what their own views are. It's to challenge those views. It's to expand those views. It's to open their minds to other perspectives, to other views. They might not ultimately agree with them, but they have to come closer to understanding them. And let me tell you that I say this as somebody who strongly supported the Supreme Court's Roe versus Wade decision, but I can do I think there are plausible arguments in support of the very different perspective that was voiced by the Dobbs opinion. And I would consider myself a failure as a teacher if I were not able to encourage students to be able to see the strongest countervailing perspectives from both the majority and the dissent's position.
Nadine, thank you. I wanted, you mentioned academic freedom and I mentioned freedom of speech. What's the relationship? What's the similarity? Are they different?
It's a complicated question. Basically, what I use, and these are not necessarily scientific terms, so I'll tell you the way they're generally used among lawyers and other people who study these issues. That freedom of speech is something that belongs to all of us as members of our society. That said, in different contexts, we have more freedom of speech or less freedom of speech. Academic freedom is something that belongs particularly to members of an academic community in the context of that academic community. That said, the Supreme Court has stressed that academic freedom is of enormous importance to our society, not only for those of us who are members of the campus community, but for society more broadly, precisely because we use academic freedom to search for truth, and that benefits the larger society. Now, with academic freedom to explore ideas and on subject, without being constrained by government officials. So let me give an example from that's very current. There have been a lot of laws that have been passed in many states or being considered in other states that are trying to restrict the discussion of certain controversial and sensitive topics, or to restrict certain perspectives on those topics, namely relating to race and relating to gender. This legislation has mostly come from the conservative end of the political spectrum, seeking to suppress what it often refers to as critical race theory, but the laws are written in extremely broad and vague language and will have an enormous deterrent impact in discussing anything to do with race or anything to do with gender or sex. That is clearly inconsistent with academic freedom, and I'm very confident that these laws, at least in the campus context, are going to be found unconstitutional on First Amendment grounds as violating not only general free speech rights, but more particularly academic freedom. If I may say so, Minaz, academic freedom also comes with certain responsibility, which means that, and that varies setting by setting. So the fact that if we're in a classroom, we put aside our general freedom of speech rights as citizens, where we're free to express any perspective on any issue in any language that we choose, but we engage in professional standards, right? And so one thing that one restriction that we adhere to is we only talk about topics that are germane to the subject we're teaching. It would be consistent with freedom of speech for a citizen in a religion class to talk about the upcoming elections, but that would be a violation, an abuse of academic freedom, right? Because we're given this great freedom, but with that comes the professional responsibility to teach our students about the topic and only address matters that are germane to the topic. As you already said, we might, as citizens, to advocate particular perspectives, that is to indoctrinate, but as professionals, we have a responsibility not to indoctrinate our students, but to do the opposite, to open their minds to multiple perspectives, to increase their ability to engage in critical analysis rather than simply parroting what we say.
I think it's actually it is complicated when you're talking. I was like, whoa, I mean, it's.
Oh, can I add one other complication? Yeah. Talking about the classroom. So a very important aspect of academic freedom is that we professors, faculty members, do not give up our free speech rights as citizens by virtue of being faculty members. And the term that's used by the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, which is the gold standard for academic freedom, is extramural communications or expression. So we can retain our rights as citizens to speak on every matter of public concern, to voice our own perspectives, whether it be over social media, whether it be a letter to the editor or an op-ed. And as a matter of academic freedom, we should never be punished in any way in our academic capacities for views that we may express as citizens that are seen as controversial. Now, this is a standard that is being honored in the breach by universities all around the country, as we've seen shocking examples of even tenured professors being fired because they make what there's some students see, or some members of the academic community or some members of the larger society see as controversial statements on hot button issues that may have absolutely nothing to do with the faculty members' academic expertise. But that is a violation of academic freedom. We don't have to choose between retaining our status in the academic community on the one hand and having the right that everybody else has to say whatever we want in whatever words we want in outside the university official capacity.
Yeah, I mean, you bring a very important point to us, especially this group, because we are, a lot of us, public figures.
Yes.
And, you know, we do a lot of programming, we go around the country, we give talks, we do workshops, we write scholarship, we write books. And for example, if I were to go to my Instagram and put something on it that was controversial, nobody would care that, you know, they would see me as that public face putting something controversial on it. Even if it was a private, Menaz, a freebie, no HGI, no Manhattan College. And that is really the issue that a lot of us are facing.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you put on, right? I mean, you know, whatever, wherever you are. And that is something, I don't know how the law works in terms of that and whether you can fight the college or you can fight someone about that. I mean, can we learn a little bit about the legal part?
Yeah. And in fact, in these cases where faculty members have been fired or at worst or otherwise retaliated against, including being subject to investigation, which itself is considered to be a violation of academic freedom, or sometimes faculty members are withdrawn from teaching certain courses or they're suspended. There are a growing number of academic freedom and free speech oriented organizations that are providing lawyers, often free of charge, to faculty members to fight back against these violations, because they realize that what is at stake is not only the freedom, and I put that in quotes because the freedom of every single faculty member is critically important, but what is at stake is really the freedom of everybody, because if you see somebody else getting punished, it's likely to have a deterrent impact, a chilling impact on your own expression. So let me just mention a couple of these organizations. Hopefully none of you will need to resort to them, but I think it's really important to know that they are there and really have your back. And by the way, I'm on the advisory councils of all of these groups, and I can attest to the excellence and vigilance of their work. One, the oldest, is FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. FIRE has represented numerous faculty members and students who have inappropriately been subject to some kind of disciplinary action, adverse action, because of making controversial public statements that are completely protected by freedom of speech, and yet university officials are so pressure and negative publicity that they will cave unless there is a counter pressure by virtue of a lawsuit. Another organization that was founded just last year is called the Academic Freedom Alliance, and this is an ideologically diverse group of faculty members in all disciplines from all kinds of institutions all around the country that has pledged that we will stand up and speak up for any faculty member who is subject to any kind of retribution or attempted retribution for protected free speech, regardless of the perspective, even if it's completely antithetical to our own views. We still will speak up because what is at stake is the larger underlying principle. And I have to say, even though AFA is a very young organization, it has already had a very significant impact. So there are these resources there, and hopefully if the university presidents and provosts and deans don't have the backbone on their own, the counter pressure from the pro-free speech, pro-academic freedom organizations will help to shore up their their commitment to protecting our rights.
Great. I mean, I think that was useful. I hope someone's taking notes here. It is being recorded, Nadine, but so I wanted to just shift a little bit. You know, the title of this is Managing Misinformation, Distortion, Denial. One of the things that we experience as scholars, especially of the Holocaust, is a lot of Holocaust distortion and denial. But we also, you know, have gone through January 6th. We've looked at the rhetoric of that. We've had some horrible incidences of racism, but also of anti-Semitism. And we also have groups such as QAnon that are dominating, to be honest. My son went to the Marines for 4 years, so he has this Marine page that he belongs to, and he tells me things. I said, let me look at it. He said, no, Mama, I can't let you look at it. It's just his protective mechanism. So I know that there's these voices, these social media outlets that are everywhere. If someone's coming to me as their academic specialist, right? Scholar specialist, how do you talk about that? And what do you do with that when it's actually a well-known organization today?
So I'm not positive I understand the question. Let me so I'll start, and please feel free to give me a follow-up if I haven't quite grasped it. I do think, as a practical matter, that the US Supreme Court got it exactly right when it said, and it has said many, many times, that the best answer to any speech that we disagree with or detest for any reason, including disinformation and distortion, including Holocaust denialism, the best answer is not suppression, but more speech, explaining why it's wrong, refuting it, supporting the people who are defamed as a result of that speech. And psychological studies show that people who believe conspiracy theories or other types of disinformation actually are not dislodged from those views when there is an effort to suppress the views. To the contrary, that tends to reinforce their suspicion of the larger society, or, you know, the Jews and other elites that they see as dominating society. See, you know, our ideas are true. That's why they're threatened by those ideas. They're frightened by those ideas. That's why they're trying to suppress them. And the ideas and the expression don't go underway. Don't go away. They simply go underground, where it's much harder to refute them. It's much harder to counter them. It's much harder for law enforcement to monitor these communications to make sure that they don't lead to actual planning and execution of illegal and dangerous and violent actions. So as a practical matter, we have to, you know, what all of you are doing, I salute you and I thank you. As the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, in particular, I could not be more grateful. And by the way, some of the leading scholars of the Holocaust, I need not tell you, you are among those, but are among the strongest opponents of any attempt to suppress Holocaust denialism, precisely because the most effective way to deepen people's understanding of that tragedy and what led to it is to engage in debates, including debates about the kinds of factual details that are raised by Holocaust deniers.
Just one more question. You can give it a comment. That was perfect. And then we'll go to questions on the floor. I wanted to ask you, Nadine, how I'm going back to this misinformation. So for example, media is, a machine, right? It's a machine. It's something that directs, but also distorts, it exaggerates, it expands. I mean, we've all studied propaganda thoroughly. And so how do we tell our students in classes that, certain facts, historical facts by big organizations like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, I mean, just name it, are not true? How do we convince the future generation that the information mill is distorted? And what does that do to the future of our students and their trust in us as Americans, but also constitutional Americans?
It's such a great question. And it's, one phrase that we constitutional lawyers use a lot is referring to the Constitution. Our whole constitutional system of government is a delicate balance. On the one hand, a certain amount of distrust is really good, right? That's part of critical analysis, is a healthy degree of skepticism, not only about the media outlets that you mentioned, Minas, but all media outlets. If you read any story or listen to any story in any publication, whether it's left, right, or center, about something that you know about, you will know it is never completely accurate, right? Among other things, because there's some oversimplification. So, so a healthy skepticism and taking everything one is subjected to in media with a grain of salt is very positive. On the other hand, if it becomes so distrustful that you see everything as fake news, or as Hitler used the phrase, the lying press, that is also very destructive of democracy, because there's then no basis for any kind of civic discourse and negotiating in order to solve and address very complicated public policy issues. Now, as I need not tell you, there is such a push starting in the earliest ages of education, including preschool, to teach critical media literacy skills. This is absolutely essential. All of us, including those of us who have been around for a while, have to constantly renew and update our ability to critically assess everything that is input into our brains, but also to learn how to do our own fact checking and what sources to trust, what not to trust. For all of the critiques that we hear about, misinformation and disinformation online, we tend to lose sight of the unparalleled resources that are provided by the internet to make it easier than ever to do our own fact checking. It is so easy now to go to original sources, right? We don't have to depend on any gatekeeper. We can go to those who are doing the research. And I was having this conversation yesterday with somebody who pointed out, the most credible sources now, secondary sources, contain links to document. So you can check, they make a factual assertion, but you don't have to take their word for it, right? Because they provide a link to where they got that, and you can double check it. And that's the kind of skill that we have to instill in our students. There's a lot of bad news out there. Surveys have been done that show that even, college students, even at prestigious colleges, such as the ones where you teach, can't even tell the difference between an opinion piece and a news piece. Don't have any way to assess the credibility of something they read, that too often they'll look at something very superficial, such as, is it beautifully formatted? Does it have nice diagrams and illustrations? As that means it must be true. So that's very bad news on the one hand, that there is so much media illiteracy. On the other hand, and I'm an activist, so I'm an eternal optimist. On the other hand, that means there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, right? We can very quickly increase the media literacy, and approach this degree of healthy skepticism on the part of our students and everybody else in our society.
Yeah. Sorry, I just lost my mic. Yeah, I mean, I like that point about, just college students. I mean, I have 2 kids and they still ask me if I say, oh, I'm going here and here, and they'll say, and meet me there, they'll say, well, where is it? I said, Google it. I mean, it's amazing, right? So, or my students will say, how do I find the USC Sherman Foundation or the Holocaust Museum? I said, Google it. They have a website. So it's really interesting how this is, that they are born with it, but at the same time, they have this kind of block. And I think it's about knowledge, right? It's about how to use it as a tool properly. And I think that's what we need to teach. So I appreciate your response about teaching the skills very early on.
And the resources for doing this are really expanding exponentially because there are so many universities and foundations that understand how critically important this is. And every day there are more resources available easily online precisely for increasing these skills at every level.
Okay, I mean, I'd like to open it. I'm going to turn you around, Nadine. I'm still here with you, but you could see some of the crowd for dinner. Everyone's waving to you. And, if somebody on Zoom has a question, please type it in. If someone in the audience would like to ask a question, I'm happy to bring them up. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much. I'm Bjorn Krondorfer. I run an institute and teach at Northern Arizona University in Arizona, co-chairing the consortium. I have a question about the difference between disinformation and misinformation. Whether legally there's a difference, and I think I know the answer, but I would like to hear your opinion. If disinformation is the intentional withholding of facts and intentional lying or distorting of facts, and misinformation is just being gullible with what you're being fed and you don't know better. I think as educators, we are trained to deal with misinformation, but not with disinformation. And as center directors, we are faced with disinformation and have to somehow respond to this. So to me, anyway, there's a huge difference because I can handle in a classroom misinformation to some extent successfully, I think. But disinformation is a whole different story. So between being an educator and a center director, I feel like I need to respond differently to these kind of distortions, so to speak. Any comments and ideas on how we can handle this?
Thank you so much. And I know that the Arizona State University system has been particularly committed to free speech and civic discourse and academic freedom initiatives. And congratulations on your work at your center. So you're exactly right that misinformation is a term that is generally used to refer to intentionally false or misleading information. And disinformation is a much looser term that is used much more subjectively and arbitrarily to refer to anything that somebody disagrees with. And I think, your response as an educator to either kind of false or misleading information, as long as it is educational and not punitive, is completely appropriate. And it's appropriate for you to use your educational expertise to deal with each situation, even beyond those 2 broad categories. I have no doubt that you will deal with every single instance in an individual way that takes into account all of the facts and circumstances. What is the most effective way to counter the false or the misleading aspect of that communication? And one of the reasons why, as educators, it's we eschew punitive approaches is that's not a way to change somebody's mind or to open somebody's mind, right? To punish them. No, we try to use more positive, persuasive educational techniques. Getting beyond our role as educators in the legal system, since you did also ask me a legal question, the only kinds of false or misleading statements that are legally subject to punishment under the American system, I think appropriately, are those that are intentionally false and misleading. And that's exactly right. We would be loath to give the government power to punish somebody for negligently feared that, we might inadvertently say something that's not true and be subject to punishment. And that's why probably the most famous example that I'm sure all of you know about is in the situation of libel, New York Times versus Sullivan, that we are free to make even false statements about public officials as long as we do not do so intentionally or recklessly.
Thank you, Nadine. Is there someone else who has a question? Oh, there's a bunch. Okay. Introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. I'm David Simon.
I can't hear any question. I'm sorry.
There.
Yeah, I was muted. My name is David Simon. I'm the director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale University, where we have an initiative called Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era, which looks at, among other things, the role of social media in fomenting mass atrocities and genocide abroad, essentially through incitement. And so, thankfully, I think we don't have an explicit issue of mass atrocities and incitement over social media in the United States, but we could. And I guess what I wanted to hear your thoughts on were about the role and the responsibility of social media companies to prevent the amplification of disinformation that can potentially lead to violence and or short of that, discrimination, and B, incitement, the types of things that are direct efforts to lead violence, to foment violence against certain people, and especially against certain people because of their group membership.
Excellent questions. Thank you so much. And as I'm sure your question recognizes a basic fact that is not known by everybody. So let me start by making that explicit, which is that social media companies, by virtue of being private companies, are not bound to honor the First Amendment protections of free speech for the rest of us. So social media companies are completely free to limit and restrict and even completely block expression that the government would not have the power to block. And those of us whose communications would thereby be restricted on social media have no First Amendment claim against the media companies. Moreover, the media companies themselves have their own First Amendment free speech rights to decide what communications they will host and which ones they will not host. So I think it would be completely appropriate for those companies to decide, as a matter of corporate responsibility, as a matter of social responsibility, that they want to take steps to de-amplify, to prevent the spread of communications which, while constitutionally protected, might still sufficiently contribute to discriminatory or violent actions that they just don't want those to be on the platform. What I'm more skeptical about, and I know that many people are studying this, including you and others of your colleagues at this conference, is whether those de-amplification strategies are effective, and whether they might in fact be counterproductive for reasons that I already alluded to. And we all know, among other things, the forbidden fruit phenomenon, that the more efforts there are to restrict certain speech in the hope of reducing the attention that it receives, sometimes there is an absolutely opposite impact, which is that tends to increase the attention that it receives. Since all of you are experts in the Holocaust, I'm sure you know that that was the impact of the enforcement of hate speech laws in the Weimar Republic in Germany, very strictly enforced against Nazi propagandists, with the result that they received much more attention and even much more sympathy than they otherwise would have. So as a principled matter, I would completely defend the company's right to do that. As a strategic matter, I really encourage ongoing research by the experts at the conference and others in terms of, what is an effective way of muting the message. And I also to look at the proactive, positive ways of amplifying other messages. This is often, called counter speech. It's a little bit of a misnomer because it sounds more defensive, but the term counter speech is used to refer to any communication that counters ideas of hatred, but it could be proactive. So positive education and information about the Holocaust, about genocide, about human rights, promoting values of dignity, equality, and inclusivity and diversity. There are many initiatives that are going on now, including on the part of social scientists and engineers and others, looking into how we can maximize the effectiveness of counter speech online, ways to reach out to those who are tempted to go down hateful rabbit holes, to lure them away from that. And there's some very exciting, there was a conference that I participated in recently that was hosted by Cambridge University that included just really interesting scientists, including mathematicians, who are exploring algorithms that are being designed to respond to proactively hateful memes and messages online.
Hey, thank you, Nadine, so much. One more question, and then I would like to close out. If there's someone, there were a bunch of hands that went in earlier. Yeah, David?
Hi, Nadine. I'm Dave Fry. I'm a professor of history and director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at West Point. And I want to kind of pick up on what you just said and ask a question related to that. I'm not worried about students in my class and publics that we speak to that accept the ground rules that you kind of laid out at the beginning. The ones who say that, yes, we agree to not having ad hominem attacks, and we agree to civic discourse. We agree to the idea of fact-based argument. That's not, if they agree to those basic rules, they're all teachable and they're all capable of changing their minds. That's not the audiences that we worry about, I think, as instructors. What we worry about are those who don't accept those rules and those who are also incentivized not to accept those rules. There are some for whom making we had a case recently where there were 3 individuals who chose not to get vaccinated and they were kicked out of the Army. And then lo and behold, they appear on a primetime news show and they get job offers as a result of that. And they get into other colleges without any kind of questions. And so there are incentives and benefits to rejecting the rules and to saying that, no, I'm not going to agree those basic principles. My basis of truth is what I believe. And it's a small circle of other individuals providing the information. And in addition to it, I'm glad you just talked about a group that is finding positive ways, but all of the evidence that I've read is that dis and misinformation spreads at a much faster rate, 6 to 60 times faster than regular good information. And so the idea of basically putting the good information out there is a race that you won't win, because the bad information and the disinformation spreads much quicker and is much harder to disengage or to get people to disengage from once they've adopted it as part of their belief, as opposed to trying to convince them in the classroom. So as people who are both instructors and public scholars who engage with the general public, many of whom will never go to college or haven't gone to college, how do you, does this idea of free speech work in today's society? And I'm inclined to believe it does, but how do you defend it against these new sources of information that make it so difficult to respond?
Excellent question, and very prevalent and important concerns. And I am happy to report that the studies that I have read, including meta studies of studies, actually contradict that familiar belief that disinformation travels faster than information, or that it can't be countered effectively. Let me refer you to a couple of studies that have, including meta studies, that have been done by the Oxford Information Institute. The Columbia Journalism Review within the last year or two also published an excellent survey of the literature on point. And it turns out that there are disinformation about disinformation, which is really encouraging. In addition to those studies, which is not to say that, of course, there can be some people that are not going to be open-minded. And by the way, I have to say that this is a really important point to make, that this is true for people on both ends of the ideological spectrum. There are some who are just true believers and who are not going to be shaken by exposure to different perspectives. But by and large, I'm really encouraged by what I've read of the studies. In addition, there is a lot of anecdotal information, including memoirs and biographies and TED Talks and whole organizations of people who were committed hate mongers, members, and even leaders of white supremacist and other hateful organizations who have been redeemed. And that's the term that they often use, rather religious terminology, as a result of, never as a result of punishment, never as a result of cancellation, shaming, shunning, stigmatizing, but always as a result of incredibly patient, empathetic outreach and interaction with people who are seeking to help them to question their own ideas. And I love reading these books because I have just the utmost respect for the interveners who have the patience to engage in these ongoing communications. Let me mention just a couple prominent examples. One is a guy named Derek Black, who was born into a family that were leaders of the white supremacist movement. His father still is. His godfather was David Duke, who was head of the Ku Klux Klan. Some of you may remember he actually did very well in electoral politics. And Derek was the rising leader of this movement in the younger generation, who was led out of his views as a result of friendship, or not, not intimate friendship, but he was treated respectfully and cordially by students at the college that he went to in Florida, a liberal arts institution, including Jewish students, Black students, gay students, everybody he thought he was prepared to hate. And simply by interacting with them, he began to question his own views and ultimately repudiated the white supremacist movement. And a whole book, wonderful book, has been written about this by a Washington Post journalist. Another really prominent example is Megan Phelps Roper, very similar to Derek Black, came from a family dynasty of haters, the so-called Westboro Baptist Church, best known for its website and its slogan, please forgive me for quoting it, GodHatesFags.org. They were the ones who demonstrate outside military funerals, basically preaching hatred of gays and Jews and Blacks and Catholics, everybody who's not a member of their church. And again, went, having been born into this church, it's a family enterprise. She went online on Twitter to try to recruit for the church, and through those channels was engaged in communications with other people, including an Orthodox rabbi in Israel, who just started talking to her about which Bible verses they were relying on and different ways to, raise questions in her mind about different ways of interpreting those verses that ultimately led her to repudiate her church, which meant leaving her entire family. So, and there's a whole organization called Life After Hate, which is based in Chicago, which was founded by leaders of white supremacist organizations who, all of these people feel that they can't ever make up for the damage that they've done, but they're going to devote the rest of their lives to trying to prevent other people from going in that direction.
Well, thank you so much, Nadine. I hope to meet you one of these days.
Promise, we've got witnesses. We are going to meet in person.
Okay, and I just want to say, I mean, you're just so, wow, you're like your speech, you're so like calm. These are very controversial issues. I would be like jumping up and down, but you're just really graceful and full of really actually new information, because we are not in the law field. And I think that's why it's important for us to hear voices that are outside of our field, that are looking at law, looking at legality in different ways than we are. So I really, really appreciate your expertise and for honoring us. I know you're still committed for Zoom, and I really appreciate it. But next time I'm going to give you a big hug. Thank you so much. Everyone give her a big applause.
If I can help you in any way, please never hesitate to call. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.